Hello. Now that the second trimester has ended, I am finished with the varsity rugby season, and I just want to go over how it went as a whole, um, the learning outcomes that I tried to or did address, which I'll talk about later, and what I'm planning to do to extend this experience and maybe go further in playing rugby. So, in terms of the season, I feel like this was one of great change. I developed a lot, and I had a lot more game time and a lot more responsibility than I did last year. And this was kind of evident during CSEC when I played far more than I did last year. And when some of the people were off, like Ken or Calvin, who are the captains, I sometimes had to take the responsibility and try and lead the team who were on the field at the time. And I just want to say that it was a great honor to have been able to do this, and that it is also a great responsibility that has developed me both physically and mentally. Talking more through a CAS lens, I had chosen two learning outcomes, those being identifying own strengths and developing areas for growth, and demonstrating that challenges have been undertaken developing new skills in the process. First of all, I feel like just taking the time to join the team and work with them in itself was a great challenge. Coach Jared, he makes the trainings really tough and physical, a lot of cardio, a lot of that gritty work that nobody really wants to do, but it's still extremely helpful in our game and our mental aspect. For example, one of the biggest challenges of this year was to emphasize and work on our stamina, as this is a game of high intensity for 14 minutes, so you have to sustain a high level of performance over a semi-long period of time, which is, although not what people typically think of as endurance, it's more difficult than it sounds. It's actually, I would think of sevens rugby as more like a 14-minute sprint than anything. Anyways, to keep our endurance in check, we had to work a lot on our bronco testing, which is a common kind of endurance testing that they do in rugby, where you have to run. It's essentially a suicide where you have to run 10 meters, jog back, run back, run 20, jog back, and then run 30, go back. And you have to repeat this 5 times, and you have to be able to make it all the way through in under 5 minutes. And to top it off, he did this right before the break, and he expected us to improve our time after the break. And this was extremely intense and super difficult, but I feel like I got it done. The next challenge was my sustaining and rehabbing of injuries. During CSAC, there are many big people who are extremely physical and extremely skillful in the game of rugby, and they know how to play in a way that prevents injury while also going full out. While this is true for me most of the time, did experience many injuries during the CSAC tournament. I had and still have a partially torn ligament in this area of the wrist. I have had an immense pain in my lower back. I thought it was spinal, but it's actually muscular. I have neck pains from scrums, and I also was unable to sprint at the end of the day because I felt like I was almost like brain dead, and it took a long time to recover the injuries. Nonetheless, I played the games, and I learned and developed mental toughness even through adversity, and I also learned, which is arguably more important, how to rehab injuries properly. I've since I'm young, I have never really thought about injuries. I just land on my wrist badly and I say, oh, I'll just give it a week. And I just keep doing what I'm doing and eventually heals. But since I had so many injuries at once, and I wanted to pick up where I left off when I came back from NIST with my exercise in the gym and my jogging and also my playing of basketball, even rugby, and even just writing things down. I did a lot of research on trying to make sure that my arm was good, my neck was good, and I learned the RICE technique, which is rest, ice, elevation. Oh, no, rest, ice, compression, elevation. And it has been immensely helpful for me, and I feel like I'm better than I ever was. In terms of identifying my own strengths and developing areas for growth, I've been playing rugby for a really long time, but nonetheless, I still feel like there are certain aspects of my game which can always be improved. Not only that, but I've also developed some interdisciplinary and what is it called? There's a word I'm looking for. It's right on the tip of my tongue. It's interpersonal skills. I learned some interpersonal skills too. So in terms of my actual game, I developed a lot of my vision. I had a really bad habit, and I still kind of do, where, well, first, okay, one of the fundamental parts of the game is when you pass the line, the line of defense, there's often usually a one-on-one match, a one-on-two matchup where you have a partner or a teammate on the side of you and one defender. And all you have to do is either step the man or pass it to the open man who has a lot of space and a lot of momentum and speed because he just ran off the line without the ball. But for some reason, whenever I'd pass, I wouldn't look at them, and I'd try and fake out the defender by keeping my eyes on them, but I would almost always completely miss the target, and it would result in a turnover, such as a forward pass, or the person would fumble the ball because I threw it so horribly. I've gotten better at this, but I still have some work. I also improved my kicking. Before, I used to not be able to kick, and some argue I still can, but during practices, I just worked on my drop kicks, and I feel like I improved on them. And finally, in terms of the interpersonal skills, as I've talked about earlier, mental toughness is a huge part of the game, and I feel like this season has shown a lot. I've had increased roles, I've had more injuries than ever, and I've also had other responsibilities. You know, I'm in year 12 now, so it's a big jump from year 11, and there are a lot of outside responsibilities that I need to address, and yet I still was able to sustain because of the mental toughness I developed and the don't give up ethic that the game brings, and Coach Jared brings especially. But overall, I think that this was an excellent season, and I just want to say that I love the whole team. I love everyone there. I love the coach. I love the players. And I would love to spend more time with them, and it's really unfortunate that the year 13 boys are leaving. I love them all. Thank you, and this has been my final reflection for Varsity Rugby.